Cormac McCarthy's 1985 novel Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, based on the exploits of the infamous Glanton Gang, a group of scalp hunters wreaking carnage on the Texas-Mexico border of the 1850s, is a brutal, beautiful, inspired novel, and a modern, visionary masterpiece, one that demands our full attention, despite its unsettling nature. So today we're going to talk about how to read this novel in preparation for the Blood Meridian lecture series and guided reading experience at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Blood Meridian is a difficult novel and it presents many challenges. Its challenges are both emotional and cognitive. Cormac McCarthy invests his work with great amounts of aesthetic splendour, and his prose reaches the heights of sublimity evocative of Melville, Faulkner, Shakespeare, and the King James Bible. But the work also very much bears the marks of being a postmodern novel and presents many challenges to casual and deep readers alike. Challenges that require different paradigms and tools in order to be overcome. Now, I would say that assimilating McCarthy's linguistic virtuosity is actually easier than learning to stomach the incessant bloodshed that is at the heart of the novel. Indeed, there wouldn't be a novel without the carnage, without the violence. The sickening descriptions of scalping and bloodshed and utter mayhem are one of the reasons why many readers will put Blood Meridian down, myself included. After my first reading, I needed to put the book down, and indeed after my second reading too. I would wager that the amount of readers who pick up Blood Meridian far exceeds the amount of readers who are able to read it all the way through. Most readers will pick up Blood Meridian and they will not finish it, whether they find themselves understandably stumped by the language choice, the aesthetic decisions that McCarthy makes, or whether they find themselves unable to bear the harrowing bloodshed. Many readers will put the book down, and this is part of the value in having a reading group, a community of like-minded lovers of literature who can signpost their difficulties along the way. And with a great group like the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we can effectively coach each other through those difficult sections. We can flag them up and discuss them, because of course we don't know what we think about something until we discuss it, or until we listen to somebody else discussing it, or until we write about it. And with Blood Meridian, readers will run into difficulties. But discussing those difficulties, writing about them, and listening to them being discussed in lectures is a great way to overcome those difficulties and breach McCarthy's dusty red wasteland and gain an intimate acquaintance with the novel. There's of course an argument to be had whether it is desirable or not to have an intimate acquaintance with McCarthy's novel, but as it is a visionary piece and it fits within the same dark canon that houses Shakespeare's tragedies and the masterpieces of Dostoevsky, I would say that Blood Meridian, whether we like it or not, whether we find it sickening or not, and of course we do find it sickening, Blood Meridian has things to tell us about ourselves, our human nature, history, and man's search for meaning. Now, I would say that Blood Meridian is the most difficult book we've had on the book club schedule to date. Yes, Emily Bronte does difficult things with dialect, McCarthy does that too, and Bronte is deliberately difficult to decipher for many reasons. Her masterpiece is incredibly labyrinthine. And yes, we have James Joyce on the horizon, and those who find McCarthy almost impenetrable have a lot of fun in store for them when they come to James Joyce. But because Blood Meridian is an incredibly difficult novel, it necessitates a guide. And that's the aim for this introductory video too. Now, a quick note about spoilers. I will be refraining from significant spoilers and I won't be touching upon significant plot details. However, we will be illuminating character. And part of the joy in breaching a new work is having a character slowly revealed to us, learning more about that character. So indeed, if you want to keep learning about the judge, for example, Judge Holden, one of the most frightening figures in all of literature, the most frightening personage if we remove the spiritual personage of the temperamental God of the Old Testament. If you would like to keep some of those character surprises in store, then we have timestamps, so feel free to skip or jump to any section of the video that is most useful to you. But any spoilers will of course be superficial, because this is an introductory video designed to prepare you to breach the work. Now let's get into the first tip, and let's discuss McCarthy's language. And before we launch into the first tip, I would like to recommend an edition of Blood Meridian for you. I have all the popular main editions currently on the market. No, I don't have the super expensive, super rare editions, though I most certainly would love them. I really like the Picador paperback edition, though if you want a hardback, the Modern Library hardback that you can see behind me is also very good. I like the Picador because it's really great for marginalia, and there's a lot of room in the margin, there's a lot of space between the lines for you to jot down notes, which is something you absolutely should be doing with Blood Meridian, treating it almost like a philosophical tract and doing your thinking on paper. So I recommend the Picador, and in the Blood Meridian lecture series I will be referencing the page numbers of this edition and the chapters too. The page numbers are relatively close in all the popular editions, but we'll most certainly be pointing at the chapters as we go through the work as well. Now let's talk tips. The first thing you need to be aware of when you read McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and this is something that will have almost certainly immediately presented itself to you upon opening the first page, the first thing you need to be aware of is that McCarthy's language is a concoction of Herman Melville at his sublime heights. It's a concoction of the Shakespearean substance. Indeed, we could say that Blood Meridian is hewn out of Shakespeare's high tragedies. His prose is influenced by the novels of Faulkner, and we could even see a little bit of tension between the Faulknerian tradition and the Hemingway tradition. We can see them wrestling for supremacy in some of the pages of Blood Meridian. It's quite an exciting thing to stumble across. McCarthy, of course, is also heavily indebted to the high romantic poets, that's Wordsworth and Shelley and Coleridge, and he most certainly has his prose style indebted to the King James Version of the Bible. The King James Bible breathes in every single line of Blood Meridian. Let's take a quick look at McCarthy's biblical cadence. You're about to hear an example of polysyndeton. That's the and effect. This is one of the many reasons why McCarthy's prose style is evocative of the King James Bible. It's the polysyndeton, the repetition of compound words matched with grand imagery and grand themes of the creation of the universe itself and of course its destruction too. A really fitting background, and the prose is a really fitting vehicle for wrangling with where one's place in the world is. Listen to this. This is from chapter 5. They crested the mountain at sunset, and they could see for miles. An immense lake lay below them, with the distant blue mountains standing in the windless span of water, and the shape of a soaring hawk, and trees that shimmered in the heat, and a distant city, very white against the blue and shaded hills. They sat and watched. They saw the sun drop under the jagged rim of the earth to the west, and they saw it flare behind the mountains, and they saw the face of the lake darken, and the shape of the city dissolve upon it. They slept among the rocks, face up, like dead men, and in the morning, when they rose, there was no city, and no trees, and no lake, only a barren, dusty plain. So, what's a good way to prepare for a reading of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian? Well, if you want an intensive reading experience, I would recommend that you read around Blood Meridian with some of the following Pieces of literature. Whilst reading Blood Meridian, you may wish to simultaneously run a deep reading of the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, in the King James Version of the Bible. I would recommend starting with Genesis. You may wish to thread bits of Faulkner into your secondary reading. As I Lay Dying is a top choice for Faulkner. You may wish to read the short stories of Ernest Hemingway, sample the different short stories and ponder about how McCarthy introduces those two styles, polar opposites in aesthetic, and has them wrestle on the dusty plains of Blood Meridian. I would also recommend a chapter-a-day approach to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. This is Cormac McCarthy's personal favourite novel of all time, and I think it shows. Read the High Romantics. Get started with Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality. Read King Lear, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, all in close proximity. Read them as a unity. Take an evening here and there. Block off some time and sit with King Lear in your lap, and then a couple of days later sit with Macbeth in your lap. And as you're doing this, you're marching your way through Blood Meridian. Now I would like to do a brief experiment. We're going to read the very first page of Blood Meridian together. You may wish to pause this video and read it by yourself first. And once you've done that, resume the video and let's read it together, and we're going to talk about how we can break into McCarthy's prose style and assimilate his cadence. Now, if you've read it over yourself, you may discover that it's really difficult to get into. It's very difficult to read McCarthy's prose with the eye alone. McCarthy is an incredibly cinematic writer, and he presents these really strong visuals to us, but there are a few different reasons, a few different aesthetic decisions that he has made that provide an obstacle to the solitary reader, the reader of the eye, because this work needs to be either sub-vocalized or read outright aloud. McCarthy's prose poetry, like Shakespeare's, is incredibly auricular. Now, of course, it's going to be really difficult when you read that first page. You're wondering who's talking to who here. There's a blending of different voices. You'll notice that he doesn't use quotation marks, typical ways of marking reported speech, so the dialogue's difficult. Sometimes you don't know the difference between a character talking and the narrative itself, but you do know this if you hear it aloud. Let's read that first page together, and you may find it useful to not look at the words as we're reading, and I'm going to show you that it's really important to take this at a very slow pace. Reading Blood Meridian fast is certainly not a good idea because you're not going to get the full meaning, you're not going to get the full weight, you're going to miss things. And of course McCarthy does things deliberately with his narrative because he wants us to miss certain things, certain horrific things, and then we think for a moment and we say, hang on a minute, what's just happened? And then we think it over and we realise what's happened or what we think has happened, and we go, oh no. There's a lot of carnage in this book, but sometimes the carnage that isn't overtly described to us, sometimes that is the worst stuff. Now let's read through. See the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Outside lie dark turned fields with rags of snow, and darker woods beyond that harbour yet a few last wolves. So you can tell the prose style is incredibly dense. It's like poetry, and the meaning comes in the speaking of it. His folk are known for hewers of wood and drawers of water, but in truth his father has been a schoolmaster. He lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him. Night of your birth, 33. The Leonids, they were called. God, how the stars did fall. I looked for blackness, holes in the heaven, the dipper stove. Now, Night of the child's birth, 1833. You might find it interesting to know that Cormac McCarthy was born in 1933, so this is a very significant date. It allows him to contemplate what his own life might have been like a century previous. So we take it the father is talking to his child here, and that's not immediately apparent, but he's drunk and he's talking to the child about the night of his birth and the year of his birth, and we have a reference to the Leonids. And here's the thing. We might be tempted to glide over things we don't understand when it comes to great novels, great postmodern novels, but gliding over halts our understanding of the novel as a whole. It's important. The Leonids, the reference to the Leonids, is a meteor shower that took place in 1833. We take it that Cormac McCarthy read George Frederick Ruxton's Life in the Far West, where the description of a kid's birth, the birth year, is described as the year it rained fire. Now, fire is a really important image in Blood Meridian. We'll talk about symbolism later in the video. But this year it rained fire was noted by everybody. Multiple indigenous peoples recorded this year. And so it's important to know that the kid, who is our central protagonist, is born during a meteor shower. Let's go on. The mother, dead these 14 years, did incubate in her own bosom the creature who would carry her off. The father never speaks her name. The child does not know it. He has a sister in this world that he will not see again. He watches, pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. All history present in that visage. The child, the father of the man. From then on, McCarthy does some interesting things with time. He blends different tenses, the present tense and the past tense and the past perfect tense. He blends the different voices that are talking to us, and all the while he is communicating this story with a thoroughly biblical, high romantic, Shakespearean, Melvillian and Faulknerian cadence. So of course you can see that this is a very difficult book, but when you run into difficulties and you think, I don't quite know what's even happening in this scene, my first tip to you is to slow down and to read it aloud. If you're feeling shy about doing that, you might want to subvocalize the words on the page. That means move your lips and your tongue, maybe whisper the words or listen to somebody else reading it aloud, and you will get the meaning. It will be a lot more apparent what's going on in the book when you do that. It's important to note as well that great books do throw up initial difficulties, especially postmodern novels. Think of any one of your favourite postmodern writers, your Chuck Palahniuks, your Bret Easton Ellises, your Anthony Burgesses, and you will know that it took a little bit of time to orient yourself in the world they had created. So another thing to keep in mind is that you do need to persevere. There's a reason why McCarthy is making it difficult to assimilate at the start. We begin and we find ourselves in this foreign, barren, ugly wasteland. We don't quite know what's happening. Other than the fact that stretches of boredom seem to be punctuated by extreme violence, it's unpleasant. We're shocked and we're scared and we're alienated and completely estranged. And estrangement, of course, is an important tool in any writer's toolbox. But once we assimilate, once we get used to the language, we now become ingratiated into the gang, whether we like it or not, and we move through different stages. One stage being alienation, learning to wrangle with the environment we've now been thrust in. And of course, if you think about how you might feel if you were thrown backwards in time to almost 2 centuries at this point, this would very much be your feeling if you found yourself spat out of a time machine. But then you get used to everything, and then as you understand the way language is being used and what's being communicated, then you find yourself feeling incredible amounts of revulsion. You find yourself sickened. And then after a while, you find yourself numb to the violence. And maybe along the way, you may even find that the violence is high art. Again, whether we like it or not. Another thing you should comfort yourself with is the idea that it's okay to look words up, and indeed, a reading of Blood Meridian demands it. Cormac McCarthy deploys archaic lexis and dialect lexis. Both are very difficult. We're not expected to have a knowledge of some of the words that McCarthy leans upon. We're not expected to have an innate knowledge of some of these really old area and time specific words. But what you'll find is if you go on an etymological excavation, a little hunt for meaning, and try to unpick the DNA of the words that are used, you will find that they're used for a very good reason. For example, one archaic word that McCarthy likes to repeat throughout the book is hove. The judge hove up. The silent riders hove on. If you look up this word, you will see a really curious thing with the etymology. You'll see that this word is as old as the rocks themselves. It has a very long history. It goes well back into our language. So many of the words are deployed deliberately because McCarthy's trying to achieve an effect that tells us that something is as old as time, as old as language itself, indeed as old as the rocks themselves. Now, if you've already read Blood Meridian, you know what that something is. That something, which we'll get into a little bit more detail in a moment, is war. You'll also see that McCarthy likes to take two different words and attach them, smash them together, typically Anglo-Saxon words. But I recommend you be on the lookout for these kinds of words and even make a catalogue of them and start to ponder over what he's trying to do here. These words look like this. The sight lay up a drawer, and their way was a jumble of fallen rock and scoria and deadly looking bayonet plants. He smashes those two words together, deadly looking, and he makes one word. Deadly looking is one word. Small, black and olive coloured, one word. Shrubs blasted under the sun. A little further on he says they followed the trampled ground left by the war party. War party is one word. War party. Elsewhere in the book he writes, Glanton pounded on the door with his rawhide covered club like a traveller at an inn. All one word. Rawhide covered club. Rawhide covered club. And here's another one. We can go on for a long while, but this will be the last one I tell you. They posted guards atop the azotea. They unsaddled the horses and drove them out to graze, and the judge took one of the pack animals. Pack animals. One word, not two. Now keep in mind that Cormac McCarthy is a man who is much more proud of his involvement with the Santa Fe Institute than he is his writing output. Of course, I believe he's very proud of what he has written, but he's not a typical writer, he's not a typical artist type. He likes to surround himself with scientists, physicists, quantum physicists, and indeed he has wrote himself on the evolution of language and its relation to our unconscious. He has spoken about how language is kind of like a parasitic virus. In a great essay that we'll read together in the book club called The Kekule Problem, he has written about the evolution of language being in the naming of things. He's written about the rules of language, the development of language and parable, and how ideas take form. So I'm going to leave you that information to ponder over, and we will illuminate a little bit further on these linguistic decisions that McCarthy has made for Blood Meridian. There's another really curious thing about McCarthy's prose that I absolutely adore, and I call this the McCarthyian Metaphor, McCarthy's figurative language. He loves similes. Something is like something else, and he will use like with the same biblical cadence that he uses and with. And what I would suggest is that you make a catalogue of these McCarthyian metaphors too, and ask yourself, whose metaphors are these? Here's an example. This is from chapter 4. They rode on, and the sun in the east flushed pale streaks of light, and then a deeper run of colour like blood, seeping up in the sudden reaches flaring planewise, and where the earth drained up into the sky at the edge of creation, the top of the sun rose out of nothing like the head of a great red phallus, until it cleared the unseen rim and sat squat and pulsing and malevolent behind them. The shadows of the smallest stones lay like pencil lines across the sand, and the shapes of the men and their mounts advanced, elongate before them like strands of the night, from which they'd ridden like tentacles to bind them to the darkness yet to come. They rode with their heads down, faceless under their hats, like an army asleep on the march. By mid-morning another man had died, and they lifted him from the wagon where he'd stained the sacks he'd lain among, and buried him also, and rode on. McCarthy's prose extends out of the tradition that gave birth to the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf. If you read his prose, it is riven through with alliteration and assonance and poetic tropes. Here's another example of some really nice sounding, almost onomatopoeic prose. When their eyes lost their blindness, they could make out figures crouched along the wall, stirrings in beds of hay, like nesting mice disturbed, a light snoring. Outside, the rattle of a cart and the dull clop of hooves in the street, and through the stones a dim clank of hammers from a smith's shop in another part of the dungeon. The kid looked about. Blackened bits of candle wick lay here and there in pools of dirty grease on the stone floor, and strings of dried spittle hung from the walls. You'll see as you read through Blood Meridian that McCarthy's lexis is a blend of different traditions, different linguistic influences, like the West itself. We have Anglo-Saxon, of course, we have Spanish-Mexican, we have Germanic, we have Shakespearean, Melvillian, Faulknerian English. We have the language of the King James Bible, and we have the language of the indigenous peoples. We have the Comanches and the Apaches. The West at this time and the conflicts that took place across it in Texas, New Mexico and Arizona involved Mexican peons and military, US Army troops, Ranger and civilian Texans, Comanches and Apaches, and Gold Rush travellers. So that's just a little bit of preparatory discussion bracing you for McCarthy's language. Let's talk about the Judge Holden, and let's talk about the philosophy of Blood Meridian and the thematic preoccupations of this novel. Judge Holden, as I've said, is the most frightening character in all of literature, perhaps aside from the God of the Old Testament. Of course, if you can think of another protagonist who is more terrifying, then I'm all ears. Please do let me know. But I think you'll find when you meet the Judge, he is the most frightening figure you will ever encounter in great literature. The Judge is the personification of war itself, enduring war and war incarnate, war everlasting. He is a man, if indeed that's the right word for him, because we might argue that he is not a man that we can comprehend anyway. He is a man who speaks in the language of stones and trees and the bones of things. One of the questions we might find ourselves asking as we make our way through Blood Meridian is there a God? And if there is a God, does he care? Judge Holden, of course, who we meet very early on in the novel, declares that if God meant to interfere in the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? And as we read through Blood Meridian, we might find ourselves recalling Nietzsche's dictum that God is dead. This idea of God being dead is not something that Nietzsche himself patented. This is an idea that has been with us as long as religion, as long as mythology and superstition itself. Because, of course, in order to be reborn and in order to rise again, one needs to first die. But the idea that confronted Nietzsche was the tension that arose from moving from a pre-Enlightenment culture to a post-Enlightenment culture. Pre-Enlightenment, where we had the Christian conception of God at the centre of our universe, our cosmology, moving from that and displacing God. Displacing God with what? Well, maybe science. Maybe we could say in the 21st century, politics. But the thing is, even if the Christian God is gone, even if God is dead, our human need to orient ourselves, orient our lives around meaning, that is not dead. And so, like a toppled tyrant and the power vacuum that opens up in its wake, if God is dead, something needs to fill its place. And so the problem for Nietzsche was, how do we conquer our own nihilism and therefore become our own hero or become our own gods? Because of course we would hope that we could prove ourselves worthy. If we're going to be murderers of all murderers, we could prove ourselves worthy of having dethroned God by becoming one ourselves. And the thing that Nietzsche chided George Eliot for was her belief that we could still keep Christian morality even with the Christian God dethroned. And part of his argument was that we needed to move into new areas of consciousness, and he wrote extensively about the Übermensch or the Superman. These are new areas of consciousness in which we become our own God and we designate our own meaning. Now I asked, what takes the place of the old conceptions of God, the old conceptions of meaning, and I threw out a couple: science, politics. For the judge, it is something that endures and is something as old as time itself, and that is war. To the judge, war is God. He actually says that. And for a novel that we might judge nihilistic, it certainly does trot out the old, we could say tired, paradigms of Christian thought, but they seem old, they seem shaky, they seem primitive, they seem very much on their last legs. Christian meaning seems to be on its way out, and a new meaning seems to be on its way in, but of course this is not new, this is a new old meaning. The judge is a feudal overlord figure. He calls himself a suzerain. He does not sleep. He fiddles and dances, he seemingly speaks every single language. He can talk himself out of and into anything. He takes great interest in rock formations, and he does not die. Ultimately, he loves war which is as old as stone. And he sees war as being the thing that cements men together, not the breaking of bread, but the sharing of enemies. He gets incredible amounts of pleasure out of war. To him it is high art, it is high aestheticism, and the same impulse that drives a man to war we see with the judge drives a man to dance. And in fact we might say that the judge believes the dance is reserved for the victors of war. What about morality? We might find ourselves asking that question to the judge, and of course the judge would tell us, well, when it comes down to it, you have two men in a saloon, let's say, and they have a shootout, and one man kills the other man, one man drops down dead. Would it matter if the man who dropped down dead had the more robust morality? What would it matter if the man who dropped was moral? It all comes down to kill or be killed. It all comes down to surviving. And it all comes down to being victorious. Now, I would like to read you a really great part of the book in chapter 17. This is a little bit of a payoff for getting through the book up until this point. So, of course, if you do not want to encounter this passage before you've read the book, if you haven't read the book yet, then do feel free to skip it on. This isn't really a spoiler. It's a really resplendent piece of prose, and we might find this speech to be rather nihilistic, but I would ascertain that actually it's not. And I would also contest that the book itself is not nihilistic either, though it definitely seems it. McCarthy is certainly pessimistic, but I think there's a bit of a difference between being nihilistic and pessimistic. Despite what seems to us to be frenzied, senseless violence, we might wonder, what does McCarthy think? And we might wonder, what is he asking us to consider? Or does it not matter what we think? Is what I'm about to read simply an uncomfortable truth which endures? As a species, we have long been fascinated with our relationship to violence. And if we find Blood Meridian uncomfortable, then good, it probably has things to offer us. Let me read this speech to you. So one of the characters says to the judge, "The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword." The judge smiled, his face shining with grease. "What right man would have it any other way?" he said. "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade, awaiting its ultimate practitioner." He goes on to say that all other trades are contained in that of war. And he smiles and he says men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows too that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake, because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war. For here that which is wagered swallows up game, player, and all. He goes on to talk about wagering with one's life and asks what more certain validation of a man's worth could there be. And then he goes on to talk about the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. The judge does go on to discuss morality, but we're going to leave it there for today, and we will discuss the judge in great depth because there's a lot to him as a character. We will discuss him in depth in the Hardcore Literature Book Club lecture series. Let's move on to the next tip, and that is to prepare yourself to read symbolism. Blood Meridian is a crash course in learning to read visionary narratives. Symbolism is difficult to read, and that is why many readers will not make it all the way through books by Cormac McCarthy, Dostoevsky, and indeed even Herman Melville. The art of learning to read symbol is the same art that we need to master so as to gain an appreciation of poetry. It's the same thing that we need to learn to do so as to interpret our dreams. Now, why would we want to clothe ideas in symbol, allegory, metaphor? Why can't we just say what we actually mean? Well, of course, that would wipe out a whole lot of art, because the great thing about symbolism and indeed allegory, and the great thing about using archetypes, for example, the great thing with this is that it disseminates, it endures, and it disguises. It disguises the meaning, and it clothes it in something that is more likely to endure, and it clothes the message in something that is more likely to last. Of course, when we talk about, say, Jonah and the whale, the biblical story of Jonah being swallowed up by the great fish, he's not actually swallowed up by a great fish, but if we simply said the meaning of that allegory, if we simply said Jonah was going through a hard time, then that would be less likely to endure. If the story was simply Jonah defied God, he was going through a crisis, and he needed to repent of his ways, that wouldn't endure. But the image of a great big whale and being swallowed up in the whale, that visual will endure, and therefore the message will get passed on whether it is understood or not. So that's one of the many reasons we value symbolism, and that's why it's important to read it. Those who can learn to read symbolism will become masters of their own fate and can help they can help abort their own nascent doom. Because of course we read visionary narratives like Blood Meridian in much the same way we read tarot or we read the stars. And so what I would advise you to do is, as you make your way through Blood Meridian, read more poetry. Ramp up the amount of poetry you are consuming. I would also recommend you keep a dream journal, which is always difficult at the start because at the beginning we can't remember our dreams. But with a simple focus, a simple instruction to our unconscious just to try to remember them, we will find eventually, if we have the pen and paper by our bed, we will find that we start to remember bits of our dreams. That's a really important thing to do to learn to read symbol. Jung taught us that even if two dreamers had the exact same dream, there wasn't one way to read the dream. Symbols weren't able to be read the same in every single circumstance. Yes, they can signpost certain things, but the nature of the dreamer's life is obviously going to be different from dreamer to dreamer. And of course, the nature of your life during your reading of Blood Meridian is going to be different from another reader's. So you might take something away from the book that another reader might not need to take away. So read poetry, keep a dream diary, and as you go through the book, if you notice something that must be a symbol, has some sort of symbolic resonance to you, start to catalogue and collect information about that symbol. Because the more you know about the thing you think is a symbol for something else, the more you'll be able to read it. And all of that collected information will help our evaluation. It will help us discern what the meaning is. What is the thing being symbolised? And of course we know that Blood Meridian is a symbolic visionary narrative because McCarthy tells us so. It is riven through with ideas of form and formlessness. Indeed, form gulping after formlessness, to quote Wallace Stevens. The narrative is a narrative about expansion, it's about heading west, and is really about our search for God, our search for meaning, and our search for our place in the world. In this seemingly newly developing universe, is there a place for us? And of course, where are we? And who are we? The immensity of the landscape in Blood Meridian, the void, the darkness, the dust, they all symbolise something. The judge symbolises something primal. The words on his rifle symbolise something. The fires they light, the scalps they take, the sun that rises and sets, the blood that drips from the page, the carnage they cause. This all symbolises something. Now let's move on to the next tip, and that is to ready yourself and steady yourself for a lot of violence. Blood Meridian is a banquet of blood. Now, something I would like you to contemplate with the violence is that not all the violence presented in the book is created equal. The violence is not all alike. The violence of the Glanton gang, the violence of the Apaches, the violence of the judge is all rather different. So trying to locate the origin of the violence, the impulse behind the violence, is an important thing to do as you make your way through Blood Meridian. It's also pertinent to contemplate the historical analogues as you move through the story. McCarthy is a writer who invests a lot of time, care and attention into historical accuracy. That's always been the case. You can see that in Sutri, you can see that in his Border trilogy, you can see that in The Road, you can see that in No Country for Old Men. Detail, attention to detail, and if the novel is historical, attention to historical detail is paramount to McCarthy. He spends years immersed in researching the background for the book. If you find yourself shocked at what you are reading, perhaps it won't help to remind you that it is based on things that actually happened. Now, of course, there's a discussion to be had, and we'll have that in the lecture series, the tension between history and fiction, and at what point does the historian necessarily need to become a fiction writer? What is the value and utility of presenting fictionalized accounts of things that actually happened? But keep in mind that throughout the book, there are historical analogues on pretty much every page. The judge is based on a real person, the kid is based on a real person. McCarthy clearly read very deeply from works like Union Army General Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue, and reads The Scalp Hunters or Romantic Adventures in Northern Mexico. In the 1840s, the Mexican state of Chihuahua, seeking to put a halt to the Comanche incursions, hired Anglo-aliens as scalp hunters. And the thing about the scalps is they were essentially receipts. Taking a scalp was a receipt. It was proof that you had killed somebody. And this is a particularly chilling thing to contemplate when you consider that many of the indigenous peoples considered that the soul left the body through the top of their head, and scalping, removing the top of the head, this was a way of damning them so that they were nothing more than a rotting carcass waiting to be picked off by vultures. So, scalping is total annihilation, and they definitely weren't discretionary, the scalp hunters, when it came to who they killed. In fact, the state of Chihuahua made no bones about differentiating between women and children, the scalps of women and children, and indeed, they didn't even really need any proof for who that scalp had once belonged to. So, when the Native American population began to diminish, the scalp hunters, seemingly thirsty for blood and carnage, had very much little interest in discerning where they took their scalps, so long as they could have their trophies, their receipts, and get paid for it. Now the thing is, we as humans have always had this theme, seemingly in our DNA, this theme of westward expansion. Going west has always meant promise. Now, it has meant perhaps death, you might die, but it has always held the potential promise of more life too. Freedom and a better life. we can march west and we can find a better place to live, a little place to call our own. Now, of course, as a Brit looking on and researching America's westward expansion, there's part of one that thinks, well, there was once a simpler time where you could just take your family, hitch a wagon and march west and find your own plot of ground, draw a little border around it, and that was you done. When it's down on paper like that, it seems a little bit too easy, and actually it is worth contemplating that during the westward expansion, during the marching across the country, of course, you would lose most of your party to typhoid, fever, cholera, toothache. People would just drop dead and you'd bury them where they dropped. And of course, you would be under imminent threat of ambush constantly as you make your way west and once you finally set yourself up from many different factions. So, Manifest Destiny and westward expansion, perhaps not as romantic in reality as many of the writers would lead us to believe. And though we could peg Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian as a romance, it's an incredibly unnerving romance that seeks to really put the reality of what took place, the Holocaust that took place, the senseless, mindless, disgusting violence that took place on the border during the 19th century. And if you find McCarthy's prose, which is very often cinematic, it's often soaked in blood, it's often biblical. If you find his prose, which I believe is as jagged as the rocks that are littered around the dusty landscape itself, if you find his prose difficult to abide, then what you may also be experiencing is McCarthy wishing to impress the brutality of living at this time upon us. We're not supposed to find this experience easy or fun. It's supposed to be brutal and ugly and completely degenerate. But of course we might ask, why should we read a book soaked in this much violence? Why read violence at all? Well, today in the 21st century, we have a very peculiar relationship with violence. It's manicured, it's glossed over and varnished, and it's Hollywoodified. In all of the big budget blockbuster movies, it's a commodity that we've become numb to. And very often the brutal reality of real violence is censored. We glorify movie violence, but we censor the real thing. So we have a very perverse relationship with violence, and we don't understand what the reality of violence really is, what war actually means. When we've had our notions of warfare conditioned by Hollywood movies and pop culture novels, that's a very difficult thing to contemplate, and we're very lucky in the 21st century that we're on the cusp of potentially the closest we've ever been to world peace, and yet we're also in danger of forgetting what the reality of warfare is, particularly in this age of nuclear warfare, where complete and utter evisceration, complete and utter destruction is completely assured if one party so much as thinks about detonating. Reading Blood Meridian should be unnerving, because it should be treating us to the reality of what warfare and violence really is, and what it really is should sicken us. And it should sicken us enough so that we are primed, so that when the judge gives his speech and we find it compelling, we are primed to have a conflict of conscience. We are primed to find great difficulty in his notions of warfare and war being God and war enduring. Why should we read violence? Well, why should we do deep self-work? Why should we do shadow work? Why should we learn to integrate our own dark side? The answer to those questions is the same answer to the questions of why should we read violence. We should read Blood Meridian and we should wonder if we ourselves could commit it, if we could defend against it, if we could justify it, if we could stomach it, and if we could stop it. Now let's talk pacing, because Blood Meridian has a very curious pace. For much of the novel is slow and plodding, interspersed with ultra-violence, so it creates a very curious effect in the reader. There's a line that punctuates the book throughout, and when I point it out you won't be able to unsee it, and the line is, "They rode on." As you encounter this line, "they rode on," you might want to contemplate what effect that creates. It adds a certain rhythm to the novel, doesn't it? And there's a discussion to be had about not only enduring violence in literature, but enduring boredom too. Long parts of the novel are supposed to be rather boring, where nothing really happens, and it's supposed to mimic the effect of plodding on, riding on ourselves. That's one of the effects it's supposed to mimic. It's also supposed to open up a little gap, a little space space, some room for us to contemplate the thematic preoccupations at the heart of the novel. If you find the pacing difficult, you may wish to break the book up into 3 main sections. The first section is all about historical exposition, and it gets us acquainted with the area during the 1840s. The second section is all about the Glanton Gang's scalp hunting and the expeditions out of Chihuahua. And the third section gives us the arrival of the gang at the Pima villages onwards. Another thing you might want to do is make sure you familiarise yourself with the synopsis at the beginning of each chapter. Now, this is a convention that certain Western novels deploy, and yes, it does tell you what's going to happen, so there are spoilers for the chapter. But I would highly encourage you to read those little synopses and even circle the things that you are either looking forward to learning more about or things that are making you feel a little bit apprehensive. And you may wish to contemplate what is the effect of having this at the start of each chapter. Keep in mind as well that McCarthy is no stranger to the one sentence. Now, McCarthy has gone on record as saying that he doesn't particularly like writers like Marcel Proust, which I totally understand. I don't see any Proust in him, but McCarthy, like Proust, does favour the one sentence for many different reasons, and this is something you should get used to reading. Here's a very small one-sentence example. They entered the city in a gantlet of flung offal, driven like cattle through the cobbled streets, with shouts going up behind for the soldiery who smiled as became them, and nodded among the flowers and proffered cups, herding the tattered fortune-seekers through the plaza, where water splashed in a fountain, and idlers reclined on carven seats of white porphyry, and past the governor's palace, and past the cathedral, where vultures squatted along the dusty entablatures, and among the niches in the carved facade, hard by the figures of Christ and the apostles, the birds holding out their own dark vestments in postures of strange benevolence, while about them flapped on the wind the dried scalps of slaughtered Indians strung on cords, the long dull hair swinging like the filaments of certain sea forms, and the dry hides clapping against the stones. Another thing you must prepare for is the voice, the dialect, and the dialogue. As we've said, McCarthy dispenses with quotation marks, and he also puts untranslated pieces of other languages, often extensively, particularly when it comes to Spanish, of which McCarthy himself is fluent, having lived not only on the border but also over in Spain. So if you want to understand what's going on, a little bit of knowledge of Spanish is key in certain areas. Of course, we can just look it up, we can run it through a translator, or we can choose to not understand what's going on. An interesting effect there, considering that the judge can certainly understand what's going on, he can speak all languages. What does it say if we cannot? And what does it say about him if he can? Now, keep in mind that Blood Meridian is what we might call a postmodern novel. We might define postmodernism as anywhere from 1965 onwards, and pre-1965 is modernism. Having been published in 1985, that places Cormac McCarthy in the postmodern tradition, and we need a new set of tools in order to assimilate the postmodern novels. Having read George Eliot or Jane Austen and Dickens, Trollope, that does not prepare us well enough for postmodern novels. So you may find it useful to run the History of Literature lecture series alongside your reading of Blood Meridian. That's over at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We're going to be starting with modernism and postmodernism and explaining the tradition and what you need to know to wrangle with it, because there most certainly are a new set of rules. Realism is out, and consciousness, exploring the nature of consciousness, is most certainly in. Now, it's interesting that Theodor Adorno said, after Auschwitz, there can be no poetry, and it definitely did seem like that for a while, until Thomas Pynchon broke the floodbanks of great postmodern literature and great American literature. Do not listen to anybody who denigrates American literature. I once had a teacher who said that American literature is an oxymoron. Now, I would say that that's a moronic thing to say, because it most certainly isn't. In the later half of the 20th century, and as we march into the 21st century, American literature is king. It's top. It's one of the greatest literary traditions in the world today, and definitely in the later half of the 20th century. To read great literature deeply means you will come up against American literature and the American tradition. Now, I would like to give you a few more tips before we wrap it up here today. My next tip is to indulge marginalia. What is marginalia? That's scribbling in the margins, making notes, underlining things. We'll have a look at my teaching copies at some point. They are absolutely tattered and covered in my marginalia, covered in ink. I recommend with Blood Meridian that you deploy at least 3 kinds of marginalia. The first marginalia is flagging up areas of prose poetry appreciation. Underline stylistic and aesthetic decisions that you are in awe of. You may even want to scribble a little S in the margin so that you know that you are flagging up a stylistic decision that you like, that you want to think about and return to and share with others. The next kind of marginalia I recommend is flagging up those areas of the book that have difficult concepts, those cognitively challenging areas of the book, and scribble a little C next to these when you find them. These are the parts of the book that deploy theological, moral and philosophical arguments that you would like to return to or think about a little deeper. And the third kind of marginalia I recommend is underlining anywhere you find resonance. Maybe you see something that you think must be an allusion. Surely that is a reference to something else and you want to hunt it out at a later date. Flag that up too, and you might want to scribble a little R in the margin next to these areas. Now, aesthetic appreciation or artistic appreciation can be broadly broken down into 2 main stages. The first is noticing your impression, noticing your feeling, and the second part is trying to understand why you have that feeling, what led to it. That's all artistic appreciation really is in 2 broad stages. My next recommendation to you is to reread, and I would like to offer you a recommended reading pace. Blood Meridian is a difficult book and you shouldn't seek to binge through it. I know we have all different reading speeds, but my recommended speed for you is 8 to 10 weeks. And how does that break down? That means if you read 5 pages of Blood Meridian per day, you will finish a first reading of the book in around 2 months. If you are more ambitious and you can read 10 pages a day, you'll have it finished in around a month. Which of course would leave another month to go back over it, return to your marginalia, write things around it, talk about it, and follow along with lectures, framing the bits that you've already picked up upon through the lecture. Now, why reread Blood Meridian? Well, firstly, you might need to. It is incredibly brutal and stomach-churning, and of course some of us are not, understandably, able to stomach that so easily. Secondly, you need to reread it. Information that you receive later on in the book will inform your understanding of things that happen at the beginning, so you can conduct an almost circular reading, as you can do with all great books, and after you finish it, you can go right back to the start and you have the whole picture, so to speak, and you will get even more understanding and appreciation out of this work. Honestly, I would recommend the 3 reads method that I recommend for Shakespeare. I'm a huge proponent of this. Read it 3 times over in quick succession, and you will have gained a really intimate knowledge of this work, and also bragging rights. As I said at the beginning, most people who pick up Blood Meridian, and though it is popular and Cormac McCarthy is deservedly popular, that's not a ton of people, most people who pick it up will not finish it. So you definitely have bragging rights, and your reading comprehension, what you're able to conceive of, what you're able to appreciate will have expanded too, and that's something you can take with you into your next difficult book. The difficulty of which will of course be lessened thanks to you having wrestled with difficulty in Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, so it's a good thing to do. And ultimately, if you want to find an answer to that whole "is there a God" question that seems to be prompted by Blood Meridian, then you most certainly will need to reread the book. In addition to rereading, I highly recommend that you read it aloud, or you listen to it being read aloud, and you listen to lectures talking about the book. This is something that is very much a necessity so as to understand fully what's going on in Blood Meridian. And once again, I highly recommend a group reading, because group discussion, whether you participate in it or not, whether you write your thoughts or not, or whether you simply listen to what other people are saying about the book, if you read their response to the book, all of this is going to help bring that book into focus for you. Whilst reading is very much a solitary, introspective activity, perfect for introverts like myself, there exists a really nice in-between realm between communication with other people and communication with ourselves when it comes to reading groups like the Hardcore Literature Book Club, because as you're reading through this novel, you may find it difficult, emotionally or cognitively, but at least you know that you have companionship, a sense of a community reading along with you right then and there. You are no longer alone as you read great literature. You know that you're reading as part of a group, and even if you find it difficult at this moment, this difficulty will be overcome and illuminated thanks to that group. So it's a really special thing to be a part of. And I think with a book as brutal as Blood Meridian, you need all the companionship and comfort that you can find. And what we do as a group is we crowdsource meaning. As I said, you don't know what you think about something until you write about it, speak about it, or at least think about it rather in depth. And a good reading group helps you do that. The thing is, discussion elevates the great books, and the great books beg to be elevated by discussion, and Blood Meridian, in my humble opinion, most certainly is a great book. And we're going to leave it there for now. We have covered a little bit of ground, but there is certainly much more to cover, and I am greatly looking forward to the Blood Meridian lecture series. And now I would really love to hear your relationship with Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian. If Blood Meridian is your next big read, tell us. Is this your first time reading it? Is this a reread for you? If it is your first time, what are you expecting? What do you find daunting? What challenges do you think you will need to overcome? And indeed, if you have any concerns or queries, then pop them in the comments below and we can talk about going in to Blood Meridian. Of course, if you have already read it, without giving spoilers, let us know what you thought of the book. And of course, this may contain a little bit of a warning to new readers. Thank you very much for watching today. Thank you for reading along, and I wish you all the very best of luck with Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.